to the Weekly Bioanalysis, a KCAS podcast.
Hello and welcome to the 28th episode of the Weekly Bioanalysis. My name is John Perkins and I'm the Senior Scientific Advisor for all things related to LCMS technologies. I've been with KCAS for around a year, but I've been in Bioanalytical for about 26 years. I'm here with my co-host, Dominic Guarino.
Hello, my name is Dominic Guarino, and like John, I'm a Senior Scientific Advisor at KCAS. My focus is in ligand binding assays, biomarkers, and flow cytometry. I've been with KCAS for a little over 7.5 years now, but I've been in the bioanalytical space for 26 plus years.
Today's podcast, as always, is brought to you by KCAS Bioanalytical and Biomarker Services. KCAS is a bioanalytical laboratory located in Kansas City, Kansas, serving the pharmaceutical and biotech industries for over 40 years now. As one of the senior scientific advisors at KCAS, I'm available to answer any questions you may have regarding this podcast or any of KCAS's services. We're thrilled to have you listening again. As mentioned, this will be our 28th week recording the podcast. If you're interested, the other episodes can be found at kcsbio.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at @theweeklybio and at KCSBio. We started this podcast because current business environment prevents face-to-face communication. We're broadcasting from completely different places. I'm in upstate New York, Dominic is in Kansas City, and Jeremy, our producer, is in Missouri. This weekly podcast gives us the chance to connect with all of you, and we hope it's a chance for you to get to know us too. And even more, it's a chance for you to get to know KCAS and the services we provide. As with our previous podcasts, we'll start with a review of latest news and resources and then focus on a topic of our choosing before discussing any feedback we've had from you. I hear from our producer we've actually had a bunch of questions, which we haven't seen yet, so it should be interesting to follow up, but we have to emphasize that any responses we give are our own personal opinions, but not those of KCAS. We're constantly looking for topics, and we'd be happy to discuss something that you want us to cover. Then we'll wrap up and give you a little teaser for next week, letting you know what is coming in the future. So again, we're thrilled to have you here, and we're looking forward to a fun episode today. Here's today's agenda and podcast topic before we jump into news and resources section. Dominic.
Yeah, John. So we're going to, as you mentioned, podcast number 28. We are going to move away from the drug delivery like we had mentioned on the last podcast. Instead, we're going to do what I think of as the State of the Union of COVID vaccines. So that'll be the focus point. And as you mentioned, we got a lot of feedback. So we got a jam-packed show, so we can just jump right into the news. Seeing how we're going to talk predominantly about COVID today, we're going to have just one note on COVID. Let's talk about this quick COVID test that catches the people who are the most infectious. That seemed to be a pretty neat little finding. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that story?
Sure. It's basically a guy, Christian Drosten at the Charité University Hospital Berlin and colleagues looked at the performance of 7 commercially available rapid antigen tests. So they're less invasive than the PCR, and you'll get results quicker, and found that 5 of those are actually fairly reliable in catching about 95% of test samples, and particularly catching high viral levels in subjects, so then identifying people who are likely to be most infectious. So it's one of those developments where they can identify the tests that are reliable like this. We can really provide test results much quicker, because I still read regularly about test lags all over the place. So it has to
that's still a big kind of mystery, right? It seems like especially in I guess I'm going to use like the NFL setting or pro athlete settings, where you hear someone tested negative or they're on a watch and then they test positive, but then they're negative again. It's really, to me, it doesn't, I hope some of this can be, rectified with these types of advancements with the testing. We talked a little bit several months ago now about the accuracy and precision, or even the sensitivity of these methods. And this one looks to be at about 95%, which is very good. But yeah, I think testing is always going to be a key component to helping to, I think we're going to be forever living with some sort of potential COVID virus in the future. So these types of things will help us all be a little bit more safer. And, John, maybe someday we're walking into a store or something and they can do a rapid test on the way in or something.
Yeah.
But
Hopefully, all the lessons we learned from COVID-2 we can apply quickly to COVID-3, 4, etc., etc.
yeah, and even exactly. And so there was this article is really good in endpoints here. There's actually another thing around that kind of caught my eye as I was looking at this is that you're not protected by the common cold. So I think that's an interesting finding,
Sure.
meaning,
Yeah.
and we can touch briefly on this, but it looks like, just because you get a cold or even the flu vaccine, that doesn't mean you're going to be protected against COVID, which is interesting. So that's really a hot topic now, right? With cold season coming, cold and flu season coming. There are tests that test for all three, I think, or at least two for flu and COVID at the same time. But I think you got a lot of anxiety around that, right, John? Like there's just you're out. If you see someone sneezing, you're just like, oh my God, I got to run away from this person, right?
I'm never out, so that isn't a problem. But
I
I
know.
would say that this basically these are summaries in Nature, and it might actually be worth revisiting this cold and flu and COVID as a news item next week.
Well, thanks for correcting me there. I see
Yeah,
it's in Nature. Yeah.
I saw it in passings out. Actually, I hadn't realised that my notes were so brief, so I came back to it, read the COVID bit, but I did see the cold thing as I was scrolling down. So, yeah, it came in the same day. I'm not sure how I missed it, but it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. I think it would be a good thing to talk
Oh
about.
yeah, for sure.
So,
As we get into December, we'll be talking about that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
John, we're going to move off of COVID. We got a nice list of non-COVID news items, and really, I thought the first one was a really cool one. Gilead touts pivotal data for a new kind of HIV therapy, opening towards large potential markets. So HIV is like a forgotten thing almost, but I'm sure there's still quite something we need to be. I don't know how concerned, but it was just good to see movement, non-COVID things, and good to see advancements in other, in this
Well,
case,
well,
viruses.
it touches on some of the stuff we were talking about last week, where we looking at the Fierce 15. There was the companies who are looking at antimicrobial resistance, but who have got successfully to approval, but have no market. This is really there's a market in terms of patients who have HIV, but who are developing resistance to existing therapies. So the Gilead drug, in a phase 2/3 trial, 21 of 24 patients with multi-drug resistant HIV took an oral form of the drug lenacapavir, saw at least a zero point 0.5 log 10 reduction viral load after 14 days compared with 2 or 12 in the placebo arm. So I mean a big difference between the two.
Oh yeah.
And in terms of outside observers, they're saying, yeah, this could be a small part of the existing market, but this looks superior to the existing treatment, which is GSK's
Mm-hmm.
fostemsavir, which is the
Severe,
current
yeah.
therapy of choice. So, I mean, as does Merck and GSK through their ViiV subsidiary are also in this space. And I mean, for the Gilead one, it's been given breakthrough designation by the FDA, as has the ViiV counterpart, Caltegravir. So that I mean, good to see. No one's considering this as a disease we've addressed and moving on, but still paying attention to the fact that resistance can build up with these antivirals, and it's still worth paying attention to.
Yeah, John, I think this is a really interesting thing. I mean, you got so many people that have been on HIV medications since, figure mid 90s, right? That's essentially, Magic Johnson sticks out as somebody who got it and has been living with it. And he's probably been taking these meds. And at some point, you're going to have a whole bolus of individuals who are resistant. So right now, these drugs are, they say it's like less than 10% of the market, but that can only go up over
Sure.
time, I would think. But really great stuff, John, and
Yep.
something that these are the types of things that during COVID, and we've kind of dominated COVID. It's good to see a nice breakthrough. This is a real scientific advancement in my mind to be able to treat HIV resistant people. This is fantastic stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. To ensure that those people still have hope is great.
John, I'm getting it's. I know we're just digging into the news, but apparently we got a pretty packed show today, so we're going to have to move on to the next topic.
Yep.
Interestingly enough, we got a lot of feedback, and we want to make sure we get to some questions. So the next one is J&J joins with BMS for $100 million commitment to diversity efforts. We talked about this one. This is a really nice sort of story around how the pharma world is coming together, and with all the, I'll just say, tumultuous times, it's nice to see that big pharma is trying to again improve their perception and launch this $100 million program to ensure we get diversity for clinical trials in an
Now,
effort to treat, and I think we've talked about this in terms of not only COVID infections are higher in minority groups and so forth. So this is a really good story, John. Tell us a little bit more detail
yeah, we,
about it.
we, we talked about it a few weeks ago because of the BMS commitment to diversity on trials, and to a large extent, they tagged 300 million. They've allocated an additional 100 million to the look at training component for clinical investigators, fellowships for minority medical students, and infrastructure to help build investigators build new clinical trial sites, so where they can go into areas where there isn't really where volunteer the resource for volunteers is scarce. J&J is doing a really similar thing. You're right; it all comes down to the disproportionate impact of diseases on minority populations. We're seeing that with COVID, but we see it with other things. J&J, for instance, are funding mobile vans to ensure testing in high-need areas, starting with Detroit and New Orleans. They're also looking at partnering with community clinics, federally qualified health centres to improve technology, increased STEM and health scholarships for Black students, an initiative to look at the impact of climate change on communities of colour. So it's a nice story. I really
Yeah.
to see that large pharma are doing this, and I'm sure others will follow suit. But
Love the STEM. The STEM
yeah,
section's a really good part too. I really like the fact that they're getting in at that student level because that's ultimately what'll help. I think it's a combination of education of things, and then you can sense that there would be an uptick as we get more, minority students involved. They would obviously help with not only knowledge and prevention potentially, but also be focused on curing it as well or
and
removing
also counter some of the suspicion that we
it.
talked about last week when you got frontline workers suspicious of of an upcoming vaccine. But if you've got people from your community who are qualified and talking to you, it does help allay that suspicion and hopefully then guide rollouts of things like that. So yeah,
Yeah.
it can only be beneficial. I'm going to move on to the next one. This is one where it's the catchy headline is what grabs you, but actually the story behind it is really has quite sound implications for the long term. The headline was "Worms Solve Mystery of Key Inflammatory Molecule Implicated in Asthma, Eczema, and More." And this is basically IL-33, a cytokine that's known to have a dual role in the body, either up or down regulating the immune response. And this was a study that the UPenn Vet School did to basically, they found that the activity of the IL-33 is governed by the type of cell that produced it. I don't know if you want to say more on that.
No, I mean IL-33 is it's not a highly studied thing because it's not glamorous like IL-4 or 6 or 2 or others, but it's in the inflammatory space. It's specific to allergies. It comes from a specific set of cells, myeloid derived, tend to produce it, and epithelial will produce it. So no, and continue though, John. They did a great job of demonstrating that this is like a key mediator in the disease, such as asthma and eczema, and they're looking at ways to prevent it.
Yes.
Right?
So, like you say, it's the myeloid and epithelial cells release it, and they did this study in mice, and they infected both types of cells with parasitic hookworms, which is where the worms in the headline come in. But it's mice without the myeloid. So basically, the ones who were the epithelial production cleared infection quickly, and it was a subset of the myeloid cells, dendritic cells, which actually were responsible for the non-clearance because they produced a protein called perforin 2, which allows the growth of regulatory T cells that suppress immune response. So the hope is that this finding really can then help guide how we address asthma
Yeah.
and eczema and similar diseases, and may help to explain for some of these anti-inflammatory medications that stumbled in the clinic where they looked really hopeful, and maybe this redirects how those are looked at.
Yeah, and John, I spent 5 years studying dendritic cells as a PhD student, but we were always looking at them from a slightly different lens. Um, this is very interesting. I'm familiar with perforin 2. I never really looked at IL-33 because it was all in the immuno-oncology space or vaccine space. But what is most notable about this is how, like, think about how creative they got to work backwards from the problem.
Hmm.
Fascinating stuff to be able
Yep.
to identify it. And now you're right. There's potential to say, hey, wait a minute, what we're doing here in IL-33, maybe that'll work with, I think they mentioned IL-4 and other sort of antibodies against cytokines. So great stuff. This is a really good breakthrough, and I love it is catchy worms, right? So those that don't know, parasites are highly in the what I think of as IgE mediated responses, or even the allergy and asthma space. So that's why they used it as a model for those that are
And
interested.
actually, just to not to leave anyone out, roundworms were behaved exactly the same as hookworms.
I'll I'll just let's just move on. That stuff just it bugs me out. This is why I'm not a doctor. Like, oh,
Yeah,
if you came in
yeah.
and said you had worms, I'd be like, get out of my office.
One thing that's been overdue, because we've tended to do this at the beginning of the month, I thought we'd quickly touch on drug approvals for October. But as we mentioned in last month, things are really slowing up. We've had 42 approvals year to date, but 38 of those were in the first 8 months, four in
Mm,
the last two, and none in November so far. But the two are interesting for different reasons. One was Regeneron. Sorry, one Reg- one was remdesivir, which
yeah.
was obviously moved from emergency use authorization to approval for treatment of COVID-19 patients who require hospitalization. But the other one that is Regeneron, it's a monoclonal antibody combination of three antibodies for the treatment of Zaire Ebola virus infection. So actually a treatment for Ebola, and I meant to go and look at that, but I think it was Democratic Republic of Congo was declared Ebola free, but I didn't get a chance to look on that. Maybe I'll revisit that next week.
Yeah.
But it's still. I mean, to see treat. There's been a lot of focus on COVID, obviously treatments and vaccines, but when you read into the backstory of it, Ebola and other diseases keep cropping up as people are already working on them. So it's great to see that there's um, a treatment coming through for Ebola that really could lead to eradication of that in the longer term. Which would be phenomenal.
Yeah, no, anything that can continue to help with, treatment of viruses, regardless of the virus, is such a hot topic right now. And then of course remdesivir, our old friend, which is controversial. So go ahead, John.
No, that's fine. I was going to say, yeah, that we've done the news. Let's move on to the main portion.
Yeah, and John, even as I sit here, we were hopefully going to cover, this is podcast number 28. We got a jam-packed main portion here. And I think for the sake of time, John, what I suggest is the recap of therapies, we're going to touch on that today. Let's shelve that. We'll get
Yep.
to it next week. Let's get to this. Let's just go over the status of the vaccines. Let's start with the warp speed group, the 7 of them. John, you
Well,
want to kick us off?
shall we say? I mean, but in terms of getting started, let's say what really triggered us to do this
Sure.
week, because last week when we said here's our topic for next week, we're talking drug delivery. Actually, what really pushed things forward, we did touch on last week that the results from the Pfizer vaccine had shown 90% efficacy. And then on Monday morning, we got readout from Moderna who say that their vaccine is 94.5% effective and appears to stop severe disease. And this is, both the first two are the mRNA vaccines. Obviously, the Pfizer one we discussed in depth last week. We know there's logistics problems. The Moderna vaccine shows similar effectiveness, but it doesn't have quite the same instability issue. I mean, it still needs to be stored at -20, and there's others that we'll discuss that have better thermal stability profiles. But I think it's the fact that things are. We talk about early on in the podcast, months ago. We talked about the time frame for vaccines, but here's our first two coming through pretty rapidly, where they're actually more recently this week, Pfizer actually said they've reached their 162 cases, so they're looking to move to emergency use authorization. But let's start with take a step back, go to the warp speed candidates as you were going to go with, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, John, everything you just said is part of the reason why we're pivoting over a little bit from, we were going to cover drug delivery from last week, drug delivery systems and the latest and greatest, but let's just jump right into the warp speed. There are 7 companies, and I'll rattle them off. It's J&J, and they go under the Janssen Pharmaceutical name. There's AstraZeneca with Oxford, Moderna, Novavax, Regeneron, Merck with a company called IAVI, Sanofi and Gsk. Those are the big 7. So, John, let's break it down. The Johnson & Johnson one, this one is a particular special part of me. This is a virus-like particle, and I believe it's a single shot. Those of you that don't know, a virus-like particle is actually used for the Gardasil vaccine, which prevents HPV. I've mentioned that a little bit, studied it quite a bit. So this one, I like this one. I think this one stands out. I know it's a little bit behind, but I feel like looks very promising, and maybe I'll give you a second to comment on the J&J.
There is a little bit of news on that one. I mean, we knew this was a one-shot dose, and J&J are currently in a 60,000 patient phase 3, so I think that's the largest one out there. But they're actually starting a 30,000 patient study to run in parallel, looking at whether a 2-dose approach is a better approach. So although they're confident in the single dose approach, then they're somewhat hedging their bets, because obviously you want to do what's right by the patients. So they're working with United Health Group to speed enrollment, open up trial sites, and increase diversity. So site goes back to our earlier conversation. So yeah, the J&J one's moving forward.
And John, we should touch on supply-wise. It's supply chain and storage, all very stable. That's one of the benefits of this one.
And I think and the more we talk about vaccines, the more you're going to move away from what's coming up for approval as to what's their logistics plans for how they're producing vaccine and how they're getting it out there. And that's the attention will shift, because that's where the bottleneck will move to.
Yeah, and then I think a proven track record. This type of technology is a big proven track record to it, which we got a lot of questions we're hoping to get to, and some of them deal with that. So I'll press pause on my thoughts around, the advancements in the vaccine, and we'll talk more about them. But let's move on to the AstraZeneca University of Oxford one, which, this is an AAV. That's a adeno-associated virus. I believe it is a single shot as well. This one, remember, this one took the lead early on. The University of Oxford's got, a great track record with vaccines, and obviously so does AstraZeneca. It sort of fell by the wayside for a couple reasons, right, John? I feel like there was
one was the adverse event in the UK. UK halted, everywhere else halted. Then the UK started up relatively quickly, as did everyone apart from in the US. The US recently gave approval to go forward again, and then there was actually a fatality in a trial in Brazil, but it turned out that was in a placebo group, so that didn't hold up the trial.
But that's a funny thing you mentioned there, right? Like a placebo group, which is someone who doesn't get the vaccine, dying causes major delays, right?
Sure. Yeah, and I will touch on that another vaccine later, because it isn't just AstraZeneca that's been affected that way.
Sure. And is this one, I feel like this one's pretty stable too, right? It doesn't require
I don't know much detail on that. I suspect this is another one where actually it's
hardy.
I think the mRNA candidates have been the ones that really it's the stability issue.
Correct.
It's the less known technology. They're the ones that require attention, because one that I mean, just to talk about one in passing, obviously we talked about the Pfizer, how cold it needs to be. There's actually a Sanofi one that they're partnering, and I'm not sure, can't remember who they're partnering with, but theirs actually needs to be even colder.
I saw that. Yeah, that is not the warp speed collaboration Sanofi has with GSK is different. So
it's a side to to that,
Yeah.
and it needs colder than the Pfizer, but again, it's an mRNA vaccine.
Well,
But then, I mean, I know that you've got your thoughts on mRNA, but I know there's an awful lot of attention on those. They're not proven so far, but they are seen as a strong candidate for the
oh
way of the
yeah, no,
future.
we'll talk about it for sure.
Sure,
That's part
sure.
of the questions, and that leads nicely into Moderna. They're next on our list, and they are the mRNA. I think we've talked a lot about them. They do have some advantages over the Pfizer BioNTech one because it can be stored at -20. But again, the number of mRNA approved, not just vaccines but drugs, is still somewhat limited. They were mostly in the immuno-oncology space for therapeutics. But, hats off to Moderna. They're moving at lightning speed. Their CEO is quite a character. They say they're going to be the world's largest, but we know they have some manufacturing challenges ahead of them. Anything else, John?
So because they're a small company, so it gets a few things based on their phase 3. They saw 11 severe cases in the placebo group, none in the treated, and that's where they get the suggestion that it's effective in terms of stopping severe disease. No serious adverse events. About 10% of subjects felt fatigue or muscle ache, and they're hoping to ask for emergency use authorization in the next 2 weeks. I'm not sure what
And,
emergency use
and
authorization would be.
John, when I look through these things, I still haven't seen any long-term immunological data, meaning
No,
lasting memory, right? You haven't, I didn't miss anything there. I mean, I spent a fair amount of time trying to research this list, but it just dawned on me. That's still, see, there's the one on I wonder when you think of a protein base versus an mRNA, I wonder what my immunological hat tells me. I think I know which one will be superior, but that is really what will probably, to me, determine which vaccine my opinion doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot, but which one I would think would be the one that's probably the most beneficial. Well, maybe not beneficial, but the one that I'd give my son. Right? That's what I'm trying to
I
drive
think
at.
I think I think that's the question. That right now we're showing efficacy, but we don't know the length of efficacy.
Well,
And
yeah, and even I think there's some. We can move on, but there's even some challenges with the placebo arm having a pretty effective rate too, right? So that's the other issue. I think some of it, but these that clearly are proving to be effective. I mean, the
sure.
numbers are staggering. It's fantastic stuff.
So
So
yeah, so in
go ahead.
terms of production, you did touch on that. Moderna are partnering with the Lonza Group, and they made their first commercial batch of main ingredient in the US last week, and they hope to start in Europe by the end of the month. So that is moving forward. They hope to have 20 million doses by the end of the year and 500 million more in 2021. But again, remember, because this is a two-step vaccination, 500 million is actually 250 million patients. It's not 500 million treated. So you have that, the dilution effect there. So I mean, Moderna say that it can be kept at room temperature for up to 12 hours, and they say they've devised a formulation that can stay refrigerated for up to 30 days and kept at room temperature for 24 hours. So we'll see where that
Yeah,
goes.
it's still amazing how much data these companies have produced in such a short period of time. That's a lot of work being done. But let's move on to another one that Novavax, and they really. I didn't realize they had this proprietary matrix M adjuvant, but it's a perfusion protein. They're a little guarded around exactly what their vaccine is, at least from what I looked at. But it appears to be a single shot. It's protein based. Again,
Yep.
Novavax has a nice, rich history of approvals of vaccines. So this one is trailing slightly, but I believe is heading into phase 3, right, John?
It's
That one is coming
not
along.
Not many major updates. It has actually started phase 3 in the UK and is looking to add the US and Mexico this month. But this rolls back to another discussion we had weeks ago. They have an agreement with the Serum Institute of India to produce 2 billion doses next year.
That's right. Big advantage there, right? That's a huge, that statement. I want to make sure the audience understands what you just said. They probably have the lead in stockpiling, right? Is that what you just
Sure.
said? Yeah.
I mean, certainly, I don't know if it depends when. I don't know when production started, but they're talking 2 billion doses.
Yeah.
So
That
that's
was a great,
that's bigger, much bigger numbers than we talked about Moderna a minute ago.
yeah. And,
So
and the Serum Institute of India is like, building a 5-acre campus for this, right?
sure,
Like it was
exactly.
a big building.
Yes, yes.
So great stuff there. And Novavax is certainly, if you can't tell, one that I'm bullish on, so to speak. And then next up is the Regeneron antibody cocktail, which made splashing news when our president took it. Interesting approach here. They use their antibodies. It's a two-shot effort to block or neutralize the receptor binding protein, I believe. And so, pretty good approach here. Certainly one that you'll have much better stability of it. There's probably easier to manufacture antibodies, so has some upside there. But kind of a non-traditional way of looking at a vaccine to use an antibody cocktail, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I know that we touched on it a couple of weeks ago where it had some indifferent results, and I can't remember the details.
Yeah, and this one I think is more, for me, it seems like it might have more of a therapeutic effect for those that are like overwhelmed. But the challenge here is, how often do you have to give me this antibody, right? The body's not generating the antibody. That's the power of the other vaccines, if I understand. It's not like
Sure.
they're vaccinating you to augment your immune system to produce the antibody. So all the other vaccines we're talking about fall into that realm of things. There's either a protein that triggers your innate and adaptive immune response to produce antibody and T cell responses, or there's some sort of mRNA, DNA-based AAV, associated adenovirus, where they get into the nucleus of the cell, and then it starts to unwind the genomic material, and then you produce the antibody against the receptor binding protein to prevent and neutralize the COVID particle. So I hope that's a quick little rundown, but this one does lie. It kind of stands out a little bit. Doesn't mean it's not effective. I just wonder if you need there again. I don't know how much is out there on this one, but what I do know is I feel like if you're late, I think this would have a good potential therapeutic effect alongside the vaccine.
Yeah, it's been relatively quiet on that one. So let's move
Yeah.
on to the next one, which is the American AIVI vaccine, which I don't have much information about. I mean, I think Merck were the ones who said early on that they would take it slow and steady, and there's not been really many major updates from what I've seen.
So yeah, I know a little bit about Merck and their vaccines. They're probably, they're kind of the leader of the companies we're talking about. I feel like Merck has led a lot of it with Gardasil, as well as they have a VZV system, and that's what this is, a vesicular stomatitis virus. I hope I said that, but they treat shingles with it. They treat some other things. So they have a lot of vaccines, especially in the senescents or elderly. And so they're adapting, I'm presuming, I'm taking a leap there, adapting that technology to combat COVID. And again, it's a strong player in the field. I know they may be taking it slow and steady, but I think they got the richest history, and I believe they have the largest portfolio of viruses using this technology.
Oh, I was not knocking them for taking a slower approach. I mean, I got complete faith that Merck will come through with something that, I mean, again, we talked about this. We're looking for the first vaccines through might not be the most effective, so it might be a later arriver that's actually the
Well,
one.
we're going to debate that in a minute here in terms of let's just round out. Last but not least is Sanofi and Gsk. They're doing a protein based. I didn't find too much about this one, John. Maybe I just ran out of steam. I believe it's a single shot.
I've got a couple of bits of information. Yeah, it's a protein based vaccine. The proteins are produced with engineered viruses that grow inside insect cells, and then GSK supplement the proteins with adjuvants that stimulate the immune system. And it's actually based on a similar design that Sanofi used to create Flublok, an approved vaccine for influenza. So they launched phase 1, 2 in September and plan to start phase 3 in December, and hope to know that their vaccine is safe and effective by the middle of 2021. So again, it's not right up the forefront, but it will always be one to watch. And we talked about the endpoints 38, which when I looked yesterday is now down to 29, and I couldn't see it late when I checked today. But these are ones that, like this and the Merck, will be ones that are currently low down the list that will slowly rise to somewhere near the top.
Yeah, big players in the space for sure. Yeah. Not to be, even though they might be, I don't know, anywhere from 3 to 6 months behind, not certainly will rise up over time. And I'll add, you mentioned, thanks for sharing the insect. It's the baculovirus system, I believe, and that's actually what is the virus-like particle J&J is using, and I believe Merck and their system is using some sort of baculovirus. So those that don't know, they use these insect cells. I believe, man, this is maybe late 90s. They discovered that you could make a virus-like particle. You just stick in some genomic material. They could make these virus-like particles and very stable. You can make large quantities of them. So again, this has the upside. It's tried and true. A lot of our vaccines over the last 20 years have come from baculovirus systems. It has to do with the glycosylation of how it's managed that mitigates any sort of what I'll call unwanted immunogenic effects. So vaccines are, you want an immune response, but you don't want a bad one, and so that's why I believe they use the baculovirus system. It has this
So,
glycosylation process.
so can I touch on another one that this is one that has been less talked about? Is GSK involved again, but actually collaborating this time with Medicago, which is part owned by Philip Morris, and it's a protein vaccine. In this case, the virus genes are delivered into tobacco leaves, and the plant cells then create protein shells that mimic viruses. And it started its phase 2/3 study in November 12th. I
Oh,
don't
very
know much about technology, but it just it's obviously a parallel approach to
absolutely.
discussing.
Yeah, tobacco. The tobacco system you're referring to unlocked quite a bit. I think they figured that back in like the 70s or 80s. It really advanced the vaccine, just viruses in general, because you could start replicating using this plant-based system, and it rivals the baculovirus. It has a similar an amenable glycosylation pattern to it. Is why they use it. It's all about the sugars, John. Those can be
Sure.
bad. So no, that's a good one to mention. John, we got a couple that are indirectly funded. I wasn't, again, I don't know if we want to touch on these two, but I think it's probably worth doing just because one of them. Well, let's just go down the list here. The first is Vaxart, and they're in collaboration with Emergent Biosolutions, and this was an oral recombinant vaccine, and I found that one to be, again, it was hard to discern how that mechanism's working. I couldn't tell if it was a small molecule, but maybe you found more out. But it was an oral recombinant vaccine, which implies it's a protein, by the way. But taking it orally seemed to be standing out to me.
Yeah, I don't have any information on
Yeah.
that one. Maybe that's when we cycle back to it later date.
I think they kind of kept it close vest in terms of, after 5 to 7 minutes of searching, I just had to move on. But orally, it sounds very promising. But I wonder about the efficacy of it. And
We have
last but not,
touched we have touched on inhaled ones, yeah, in other again it's investigative technology, but we have touched on inhaled ones.
but inhaled makes sense, though,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because that's going to be more of what I think of as your it's the mucosal immune system, same as
sure.
oral, but it's more in that air way passage, which is where the virus is getting entry. So, but going through the orally, there's got to be, and people have had challenges with oral vaccines, although I think in animals they've demonstrated you can, anyhow. Let's just move on. But the last one is Anovio, and I think this one sticks out because it's DNA based vaccine. So that's the first and only one on our list that is DNA based.
Yeah, so this is one where there seems to be an awful lot of suspicion about Anovio out there. Obviously, we're neutral to all this, but they were flagged very early on for sort of throwing out optimistic news items that then drove up the share price, and people then you'd next say, well, they've never had anything approved in 40 years. Um, so they don't seem to have a great relationship with the investor community. But they actually have sign off on a phase 2 trial of its vaccine, but the phase 3 portion is on a clinical hold, because there's questions over the device that will be used to deliver its candidate, and the phase 2 is really being looked at to then say should they go into phase 3 or not. So yeah,
Yeah, this is one
you
of those
certainly don't have
companies.
your
Yeah,
leaders same as a lot of the others have.
yeah, it's one of those companies we're glad isn't kind of dominating the headlines because they seemed, I recall now when we talked about them, it seemed to be more business driven, and that's my polite way of saying money driven than science. And we always, John, know that we want to stay on the side of the science because I think the money will just that's a lesser concern with this second wave upon us and the future in general, to get us back to, some, I'll say returning to normalcy is what we all want. So the groups that are out there that are just trying to play with their stocks can go by the wayside,
Yeah,
and
sure,
I
absolutely.
believe they're falling into that category. But we want to report on everything we can find, and they're certainly on the list. So that's why we brought them up. So with that, John, that kind of
I've
ends.
got
Oh, go ahead.
one more, actually two more to add.
Sure.
Um, Before we touch on obviously the clear leader, the one that I just found in passing is Zydus cadila. It's actually another genetic type vaccine. It's an Indian vaccine maker, and they're testing a DNA-based vaccine delivered by skin patch. They launched a phase 2 trial in August and are planning a phase 3 trial to start in December. We haven't touched on them at all. They really sort of snuck under the wire, but it was one I just stumbled across while looking at things
John, what
today.
was the name of that company again?
Zydus is Z or Z Ydus Cadilla Cadila. So it's one to look out for. And I mean, again, we talk. The nice thing about this is it's touching on the drug delivery topic that we're discussing this week. So you can't really avoid the drug delivery because it will keep cropping up.
So, John, it looks like it's coming. Is Pittsburgh in collaboration with them? Do I have that right?
Didn't see that piece. I was
Yeah.
looking. The summary just talked about what they were doing.
Maybe I'm looking at something a little different, but I think it's a micro needle, which makes me think a little bit about the gene gun, because that's what it's gone from gene gun to micro needles. But yeah, maybe not. Anyhow, I'm kind of, as I'm on the fly trying to do things here. There's a quote from a guy by the name of Andrea Gamboto, who I know quite well, and I don't know if that's linked to this particular one, John, but we'll move on, and
And
something I'll
one last
research.
one, yeah, and one last one. Actually, two last ones I want to talk about. Um, Very quickly to get out of the way, when we talked about deaths on placebo arm, Sinovac, which is one of the Chinese vaccines, it was on hold because they had a death in the on their trial. Again, it turned out to be in the placebo arm, and this was in Brazil, and it turned out that actually the volunteer had committed suicide.
Ooh.
Uh, yeah, it's moving back forward again. And then the other mRNA one that we haven't touched on today, it's more European funded than US, is CureVac.
Mm.
And this is the one that actually, based on their investigation so far, they think they have the edge on stability. So it has good stability at room temperature. So they think they can decentralize storage and to really significantly facilitate large scale vaccination efforts as they move forward. Although there are still questions about vaccine tolerability. And one thing that I didn't know until today, they're actually collaborating with Tesla on
Ooh.
creating mRNA microfactories, which could potentially be deployed around the world to make billions of doses of the vaccine. So
Yeah,
even
no, that
getting
actually,
into
I think I knew they were with Tesla. I read that piece of it. Still a long way to go there. Let's press pause on. I think setting up mRNA shops across the globe, but I like the way they're thinking for sure. But the CureVac one is, as you touched on, really emerging to me as the mRNA one that you could see getting worldwide, right? Because it requires zero, -20 or -80, and I think that has a huge implication for what I'll call resource poor nations.
So last but not least, let's at least we've already talked about Pfizer, but this is the current leader. Pfizer at the stage where they have hit another checkpoint so they can move forward to emergency use authorization, or at least the application for that. They've passed the 2 month follow up for the median of patients, and they've also got 162 cases of COVID in the placebo arm, and they saw 8 in the treated arm. Of only 10 severe cases of those 162, a 9-to-1 placebo to treated ratio, showing similar to the Moderna that it looks like the vaccine is active against severe cases. Um, the one thing that where I read it, the Pfizer vaccine compared to Moderna may have the edge in terms of tolerability, with only 2% of subjects so far showing grade 3 adverse events, where, as we mentioned earlier, Moderna are about the 9 to 10% range. So Pfizer definitely the leader. that's where they stand right now, and we could have doses of that by the end of the year.
Yeah, no, and that's a good way to kind of wrap up the we'll call the State of the Union of vaccines. I love my State of the Unions, but yeah, I don't have too much to add other than it is the leader. It is you really did a great job of comparing it side by side to Moderna, and despite maybe the Moderna has that edge with -20 storage, but those adverse numbers too. It's like 4x higher, right? If there's 2 versus 8, so that's something. And then it's somewhat to be determined the longevity of each of them, which
Sure.
sometimes you might have more adverse, a little bit higher adverse events, but obviously might actually be more beneficial, but to be determined there. I'm not saying that.
Yep. Yeah.
And then the
long term is the big question mark.
Yeah.
Over everything.
No, and I think both of them are fascinating, and I really would like to see how that CureVac one stands up against them as well, because they certainly are onto something. That one for me is the one that I'm probably, I don't know about most promising, but certainly one that could globally impact quicker than the other two, for instance. So anyhow, John, that kind of stops us there. I mean, where we have a couple options. We got several questions, John, like 7 or 8 of them. So
yeah,
we could tackle them and then along the way figure out where we stand on these, or do we want to have a small little 5-minute discussion on which vaccine you want to give your children, John? How's that?
I haven't really thought about it. I think I'll see what comes through on approval. Obviously, there's going to be prioritization of people in terms of who has access to the vaccine first. I mean, none of my children are in a vulnerable group, so I wouldn't see them as being really applicable for a long time, by which stage you'll probably have many candidates come through. And I think at that point it's going to be really what's available to them and what's the safety profiles of those, and nudge them in that direction if we're allowed to make that choice. I mean, that's one thing I don't know is, will you be able to choose which one you have of the ones that are available? Or how
putting that aside, I'm only going to assume if you're knowledgeable about it, you should be able to look at your physician and say, no, I would like to take another one. If they say they don't have access, then call all the other physicians and figure out which one does, and I'll go see them. But that's just time and effort and potentially money. But the way I sort of look at these things is exactly what you said. I and my family, immediate family, myself, we're not at risk, so we're not even in the running to get the vaccine. But my sister, who I've talked about, she's a frontline nurse. I wish I'd had a conversation with her, but if I were advising her, I think they're all safe. It doesn't matter what they were. All of them to date, I feel are. If I were a policeman or a fireman or somebody who's frontline, I think they fall into that category. Or even, I don't know, somebody who's working in the grocery store, they get a lot more contact than me. I would take just about any of them. Now, we have the luxury to wait, so that's a different, kind of a different approach. So maybe I'll just stop there as we dive into the questions. But I think all of them, I want to emphasize this to the entire audience, I trust and believe the data. Everything we're hearing shows that these mRNAs, which a lot of stuff is sort of swirling around about them, they appear to be safe and efficacious. So, have at it. If you're offered it, take it. And if I were in over 70 years of age, I'd be lining up to put my arm out and get it.
I agree. I mean, obviously, there's going to be longer term looking at this because we're still in the short term in terms of safety, but there's nothing being presented so far that says there's major risk to any of these. So I'd be up for them.
Yeah, and by the way, that's our opinion today, November in 2020. We could be on this podcast a month from now and have a completely different opinion on some of these vaccines, but they seem to be. I am pleasantly surprised with the efficacy and the lack of adverse events, or at least high adverse events. Nothing seems out of the ordinary. So, John, this has been a wonderful, to me, I find it to be fascinating and wonderful discussion. What do you think? Let's move on to some feedback from the audience, right? You want to take that first question, or just at least read it and we can discuss it together.
Yeah, sure. First question, Carrie says, my question is, will children under 5 be vaccinated? And if so, only with Pfizer, Moderna not tested on kids? And do we think schools will require it in 2021 in California, or should they require it?
What a big question, John. I'm glad you took it. No. I'll let you, would you want me to jump in, or what do you think?
I, yeah, I'm not sure where to start. I mean, I think again, first of all, it's a question of availability of it. It will be one thing in terms of 2021 to 2022. It also depends on what we've done in the meantime to help bring the virus under control, which we're definitely not doing at the moment. I don't, obviously, I can't talk about schools in California and what they require in terms of vaccination. So I don't know what they will require. I mean, I would just say honestly, if it's available to you, I'm sure there'll be some studies looking at children. I would say if it's available, take it or have it administered to
Yeah,
help.
this one is it's a tough question. Let's face it. The amount of children under 5 that have been given of this vaccine is probably incredibly limited, no matter what Pfizer might have done. Moderna at some point is going to have to do it. I think this falls into that category when I say it takes years to develop a vaccine. This is really the part that does getting it into children. But maybe take a small step back. Not There's so few children that they're getting it, but they're not having any, they're asymptomatic, so to speak. I don't know if it's studied the under 5. I don't know if babies are getting it. I haven't heard of any babies dying from it. So that kind of to me means I would wait on it until, like you said, it's available. At some point, if your pediatrician feels like you can give it, then take it, right?
Sure.
As for, do I think schools will require it? Now you're getting into some of the freedoms in the US that become, the word require scares me a little bit. To me, I would love it if there's a vaccine and it makes it, I don't know, mandatory or required, but that's just not how it works, right? So we have vaccines for hepatitis and polio and stuff, and there are still some kids that don't get it. So I don't know how we would, ethically want to say, hey, it's required. Now, will the state of California be one of the first to offer it? I'm guessing yes. Will it be available in 2021 or 2021, 22? I would have said no to that maybe 6 months ago, but John, it seems like I don't see why, 365 days from now, there wouldn't be a vaccine that would be potentially readily available to dose every adolescent kid going to school. But maybe I'm just optimistic today.
I'm sure we'll know more in the next 3-6 months and how things are progressing.
Sure.
Let's,
So
let's move on.
is it Aiden, right? Aiden asks,
Yeah.
how long will the vaccine work? I have to get the flu shot every year. Will this be like that? Well, we touched on this one. We don't know, but I'm just going to, short answer to me is I think the answer is yes. Now, mRNAs say that they can do it once and one shot, but I think we mean just as the mutations occur and as even our bodies start to impact COVID, COVID's, the virus is going to mutate according to how we're combating the virus. That's how it works. So I would think an annual shot is the future, but
Yeah, I think it does come down to mutation. I think something I read months ago basically said from what they've seen so far, COVID doesn't mutate as quickly as flu. So that may be one thing. Also, we've discussed in other podcasts, right now most people are focused on the portion of the virus that might mutate, but there are stable portions that people have been looked at neutralizing through that approach. And if those are successful, then you have a mechanism whereby you wouldn't have to take it every year.
And I
But
think in theory, that's why the power of the mRNA is it's a one and done shot. But I just feel like having studied some viruses, they're very, they've been around, longer than us, right? They came out of
sure,
the primordial sludge, just like you and I did. So they're going to do everything they can to continue to propagate. And it's funny, they want to propagate without killing you, which is a whole nother topic. But I do believe the one and done scenario is a long way away, if ever.
absolutely, yeah, totally agree. Yeah. Yeah,
John,
and
read the
actually,
next one. This is a
I think
good
though,
question.
I think that yeah, but to refer to Scotland as primordial sludge is really harsh. I mean, there's some rough parts, but I think you need to take that back.
All right. I was more referring to the outskirts of Massachusetts, maybe, or even Okinawa, Japan, where I came from. So, anyhow, John, go ahead and tell us what Elizabeth asks. This one
Elizabeth
is
asks, "Is
controversial.
this vaccine derived from fetal cells?" I honestly have no. I
Let me
yeah,
help you out, John. So, there was
I'll
a
try and
lot of
leave you to.
controversy about the Regeneron vaccine. I believe that's what they're asking about. So, the Regeneron vaccine got some bad publicity
So
around.
Regeneron antibodies.
Yeah. So, what they said was, is it derived from fetal cells? It is not. The fetal cells are used for the neutralizing assay for release of the drug product. So what they do is they have a fetal cell line that, if as they make the vaccine or the antibodies, it will either stop the cell line from proliferating. I don't know, the pretty sure it's a proliferative response that's abated by the antibody, right? So you've got these fetal cells that have some sort of receptor on them that, when you add a neutralizing antibody, in this case, I believe it was the Regeneron cocktail, it stops the proliferation, and you say, okay, the antibody was manufactured the right way. That's it. It is not made in fetal cells. It is part of the releasing of the product. I'm going to stop there because we probably have workarounds, but there's I say I'm going to stop there and then I continue, right? There's probably other ways to do it, but I want everybody to hear this loud and clear. The scientific community is not out there grabbing random fetal cells from individuals or trying to harvest them or any of those things. There are fetal cell lines are used, even cancerous cell lines are used, and they're not used in such a way that should be controversial. I believe we have a stockpile of them. We're not even collecting them. They're immortalized. At this stage, it's just, again, a nice, it is a very powerful tool in this case, but it is not like we need to go out and sack or grab fetuses and make these cell lines. So, John, I'll stop there, but
Thanks.
it is
Thanks.
not from fetal cells.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. Next.
Um, I'll grab the next one. Again, I think it's great. We got so many questions this week, John. um, this is from Chris. Chris asks, will those that have had COVID be able to receive the vaccine, or will they have to will they have a titer drawn to prove their immunity? Wow. That's Chris, you're thinking. You got me on my toes a little bit with that one. Will they have to? I'm going to say no. So if you've had COVID, I think that is not going to impact receiving the vaccine, would be my
No,
guess.
I would agree with that because we know it mutates, and we also know that there's recurrent um, people. If you've had it once, you can still have it a
Mm-hmm.
second time, as we discussed a few weeks ago, where there's a site in the Netherlands is monitoring the recurrent cases. And,
I'm sure. I would imagine you have some protection if you've had it, but it doesn't make you immune. Don't be thinking you can run around. And then if you've
exactly.
had it, don't be thinking, oh, I don't need a vaccine. Go get the vaccine, right? Like, just that's our message. Go get the vaccine.
And
And
as you know, it's early days, so we're still learning about it. So yeah, it may confer some immunity. But like I say, there is one case where we know there's cases where people have had it a second time, and we've had one fatality through that route in the world. So, but it can happen. So I don't see why that would exclude you from getting a vaccine.
But this Chris asked the other half around the titer being drawn. We haven't even talked about that, John. Like, there's a whole nother, like, just occurred to me. That's a huge amount of resources that are going to have to go to. Forget we talked about manufacturing it,
Mhm.
stockpiling it, delivering it is going to be a challenge. Now you got to, like, after you've been given it, you got to get a titer done to say you've actually got drawn protection. That's a whole nother. We haven't even, at least I haven't looked into how they're doing that. Is that presumably it's an antibody test, but again, is that linked to is Moderna, for instance, going to produce an in vitro diagnostic to confirm that their their vaccine's working well? I hadn't looked at that, John, but it's something maybe we'll try to figure out how they are
Sure.
monitoring the titers. Um, so, John, why don't you go ahead and grab the next one? We still got a few more.
Yeah, I'm not sure with this one. Um, Terry asks, until very recently, I believe the testing results of Pfizer showed the vaccine actually caused acceleration of COVID. What was the cause of acceleration? How did they correct this? I can't comment because I don't know anything. I haven't read anything about that at all.
Yeah, that seems to be some misinformation, or at least some premature information. I mean, I could walk us through how a vaccine, when they say caused it, it's maybe someone's misconstruing that. It's like getting the flu shot and then having some mild flu-like symptoms. I mean, so if we all have to expect, if you're getting a potentially you're getting some sort of COVID um, vaccine, and mRNA wouldn't cause it, I don't think. But if you have some recombinant based or particle based, you may exhibit, but we haven't heard any of this. I think this is probably some bad information, and we can just move on because, John, you and I have been pretty good. We spend a fair amount of time researching this stuff, and this is the first I've ever heard of acceleration of COVID due to any vaccine for that matter. Forget just Pfizer's.
Sure.
Don asks, it was supposed to be 90 some percent effective. How many people give an actual shot during the testing? So it's a little bit confusing. I'm going to have to interpret some of that. I'm going to assume they're saying let's just say for clarity's sake, either the Pfizer or the Moderna one was 90% effective. How many people were actually given the shot? John, I think you know more about those numbers, right? I think they've given.
The Pfizer trial is 30,000 people, so that's 30,000 people who've been given a shot. But what we don't know is whether it's if they've been administered placebo or the vaccine. We don't know the randomization as to how many people on placebo versus vaccine. So I don't know that. But that's one trial. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, Johnson and Johnson, 60,000 people in phase 3. The Moderna will be a similar scale. They're all going to be tens of thousands of people.
Yeah,
But there's going to be a placebo arm. So that's the way it works.
Yeah, so the current, I think there's only to date, only 100 have been put into that category of have taken the vaccine long enough to have an endpoint, right? So I think that's some of the questioning. So the numbers are still relatively low in terms of endpoint, but tens of thousands of people have been vaccinated across a variety of trials. But it's only a few hundred that we're starting to get these numbers based off of. Yeah, but John, in my experience, those numbers are going to hold out. They tend not to vary from. They tend to. They know, right? They kind of know.
Yep. So again, let's step it back. The readout for these trials was their first leg was when they had, of those volunteers who'd been administered either vaccine or placebo for both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, around 95 cases of COVID. And then they split. You have an independent data monitoring board who are then looking at data to say we've hit that point, and then there's investigation, and you look at the what we've been talking about it today, that there's a split between the people who've developed COVID on the placebo arm versus the vaccinated arm, and that's how they're determining the percent effectiveness. And also in both the Pfizer and the Moderna case, there's been many less severe cases on the vaccinated arm, indicating that both vaccines are effective against severe cases of COVID.
Yeah.
So that's
the key, right? You can still think
from.
about it. If you get a mild bout of COVID because you took a vaccine, that's a big win for you. Let's spell it out the right way. That is much better than going through the regular severity that might have been caused. So it's very positive.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was just trying to give a little bit more the number.
No, I think that's a good. You did a good job of summing that up. It is a little kind of confusing to think, well, why aren't 40,000 people reporting on it, right? Or 30,000 if they've dosed them all. But obviously, as you said, it's sort of. I feel like it's a timing issue that is when you start to say, okay, this, and they start to read out, okay, we dosed X amount. It's average 90 days, whatever endpoint they want to choose. Okay, these people are protected or appear to be.
Like I said, the endpoints all seem to be related to the number of cases that develop, and that.
And now I'm getting. I wish they could look at it from MHC and immunologically. All that would be fascinating, and over time, I'm sure they will. But there's the second to last one here is, again, this is from Lilith. Pfizer has no stem cells in their vaccine, correct. So I hope we addressed that already. The answer is no. They may, if they are using, I'm almost positive there's no stem cells in there. Whatever they may be using from an immortalized cell line would be for manufacturing purposes and for releasing of the product. They don't manufacture using a cell line. They would simply say they manufacture it in a variety of ways, but it's nothing to do with immortalized cells per se, or fetal cells or stem cells. That what they're doing is they may be using it as a release product. And even in that case, I don't think stem cells are involved at all in the
No.
Pfizer
I
vaccine.
mean, it's a question of how the mRNA is produced, and I don't know the I
No,
don't.
they don't need stem cells for that. They
Yeah,
can make
exactly.
mRNA. That's a synthetic thing they can do.
That,
I'm almost positive.
that's why I wanted to throw that out there, because that was my assumption.
Yeah.
So, last but not least, Nicholas says, I believe Johnson and Johnson came out with a vaccine as well. What percent effectiveness did it have? I'm going to take that piece first. The J&J are lagging the Moderna and the Pfizer, and right now we don't have a percent effectiveness on that vaccine. They have shown that it does. They do produce a response with a single dose. They're looking to do a second phase 3 in the 2-stage dose. I'm sure we'll see readouts of that in the not too distant future. Um, and then the additional question, also Israel supposedly came out with COVID vaccine a couple of months ago and offered to the US. True or not true? If true, what happened there? I haven't seen anything like that. The only approved vaccines that we're sort of questioning are actually in from China and Russia.
Yeah.
And we're the likelihood, if there's an Israeli company working on a vaccine, they're going to be collaborating with someone else, and there may be an Israeli company involved in one of the many investigative vaccines, but I don't know. There is not an approved one from Israel.
Correct.
That's
There's
definitely.
your answer, John. I don't know any. I'm familiar with. There's a handful of Israeli companies that I know of that are working in this space, but I'm not going to refer to their names for CDA purposes, right, or non-disclosure purposes. But I do not know of any Israeli companies sort of saying, "Hey, U.S." and I'm supposing they mean the government. We've got something for you. How come you're not offering it in the U.S.? I don't think they're there yet. They have some great technologies going on, but like you said, I believe they're probably more inclined to partner with someone than try to tout the line in the U.S. By themselves. So, not sure where that's coming from, but if Nicholas wants to ask a follow up, we'd be love to elaborate on it. But as far as we can tell, nothing has been done like that. Looks like we got one last one. And then we are going to need to wrap up here. Garrett asks, there are several vaccines in the testing phase. Are there any in production? How long do you think production and distribution will take once vaccines are approved? So this was, John, if you remember, they're already producing it, right? Before
Yeah.
it's even approved. That was the part where you and I were a little like, this is a little upside down, but they've been producing the vaccine for several months now, trying to stockpile it, trying to refine that process. So as soon as it's approved, I think there will be a fair amount of it available, but the sheer number of people that need it, and you talked about one dose versus two and all that, that's where I believe the supply chain will eventually need, or it'll hit some availability issues as they produce the first bolus. But John, I believe I got that right. They're already producing it, and
Oh,
the distribution will come over time.
yeah, absolutely. As soon as a number of companies saw that they had promising candidates, they were moving forward in terms of looking at how they could
Yeah.
produce it, and are actively producing it. Like I said, in the Moderna case, Lonza, who they're partnering with, have had their first commercial batch of the main ingredient produced, so they're moving forward. Some of the other large pharma, I think J&J particularly, were well
Yeah, Mark.
ramped up in terms
Yeah,
of
they're
stuff.
just gobbling up, and we talked about that. I feel like we reported on it. There was a frenzy of deals where
Yep.
all the manufacturing capacity was being gobbled up by basically the seven companies we were talking about, right?
Yep. Yeah, yeah, exactly, and that's why we touched on the Serum Institute in India, because there's a
Mm-hmm.
huge potential for production there. So yeah, it's one of these things that we know that development takes a certain amount of time, but the need is so acute that we're trying to implement steps that would be more under more normal circumstances would be sequential. We're implementing things in parallel, and it's a gamble on the pharma companies' part to ramp up production, but it's absolutely crucial in terms of world health, which is why they're doing it.
Yeah. So, John, this has been a really to me stimulating podcast. Not only was it a lot of fun to research it, the questions were great. I really love the fact that people are actually listening to us and asking some pretty in-depth questions. A lot of things I hadn't even thought of popped up, which is great. So we appreciate that. But John, for the sake of time, maybe I think you got a big weekend coming up, but maybe you can tell us about it next week, and maybe we'll just sign off for now. I can tell you, I got nothing going on. We're probably going to take a little bit of a hiatus for Thanksgiving. So, but John, any last thoughts before we wrap up podcast number 28?
No, this was fascinating. I'm glad we took the opportunity to dig into this because, I keep thinking about, there's all this stuff in development, but to actually have a chance to discuss where things are, what factors are impacting them, etc., was a really good opportunity, and the questions were great. I will touch on my weekend very briefly. I have a 3-day weekend because hopefully tomorrow is the first step in moving forward in the restoration of a car that's been sitting in my garage for 10 years. We'll be taking it round to a garage round the corner, get up on the lift, take photos underneath it to make sure that all the bottom is relatively rust free, such that then I'm going to be looking for someone to do a full restoration from the bottom up and hopefully have it on the road in a year or two. But it's been sitting there for a long time, and it will be great to get things moving.
That's amazing. I love it. You shared a photo of it. It looks awesome. It's got a big old, I think it's got a Hemi in it of some sort, right? It's got a big old V8 engine in it, and looks like John. I hope someday to maybe get a ride in the
absolutely
future. Yep. But it looked fun, and hats off to you. I'm sure that's a big achievement to have had it sitting there for so long and to get some movement on it. So. Sure.
It's a perfect blend, Italian design, the Chrysler V8, and then British engineering. So it is a really nice combo.
Well, John, that sums up you. There's a lot of diversity to you, right? So that your car is a reflective of you. That's
yes.
No, that my biggest thing is I got actually bought it from the UK, a 12-year-old Naka Japanese whiskey that I invested 130 euros in, and I'm really excited to try that. That's my weekend in a nutshell. I've never had a Japanese whiskey, and so this one came with a little bit of a recommendation, and I found it at the right price because it was listing for like $300 and $400, and I'm like, I'm not spending that. But this is my little treat. Not as exciting as restorating a car, but I'll let you know how delicious this Japanese whiskey is for sure.
So next trip over to Kansas, I'll bring some whiskey with me.
Sure.
So where I grew up, we actually had the distillery on the edge of the village. The school bus used to pass it every day. So Auchentoshan, who are now actually owned by Suntory, so there's the Japanese link. I will make sure that I bring some Auchentoshan.
Yeah, I'm learning about this. So some of those names are somewhat familiar. This is all the rage in my world. I'm finding new spirits to drink, and during COVID, I'm not the only one taking this endeavor, right? Sometimes, John, I forget you came from whiskey and Scotch area or Mecca of the world, but also our producer, Jeremy's a big fan of the whiskeys and the Scotches. And so as we hopefully come up with a vaccine and the world can get back to normal, all of us can get together and maybe imbibe some of those whiskeys and Scotches and enjoy our company together again as we hopefully return to some normalcy.
It sounds like a plan to me.
Well, John, what a great podcast number 28. Really looking forward to 29, which will probably be after our Thanksgiving break.
Podcast 29, we'll hopefully return to drug delivery unless we find that there's some other fascinating topic nudges it to one side in its place.
Yeah, that's a good point. For those of you that were hoping to have a drug delivery discussion, stay tuned.